So, good evening, everybody. Dear Professor Vallor, dear students, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Marie-Laure Salle, I'm the director of the institute, in case you want to. I know it's written here, okay. So, dear Professor Vallor, as I was just telling you, last summer, not quite on the beach, but not very far, I was reading your book, The AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. While only a few pages into the book, I knew that we had to bring you over at the Institute so that you could present that book to our community. A bit more than 3 years ago, as part of the strategy that I impulsed when I arrived at the Institute, we created the Tech Hub, which I have to say became an instant success, and our colleague Jérôme has been, who heads the Tech Hub, has been a big part of that success. I have to admit that. The starting point for this creation was the acknowledgement that technological transformations, particularly, but not only those connected with digitalization and artificial intelligence, were creating unprecedented challenges for our societies, our polities, our economies, and even for our individual and collective identities, for the nature of our social links, for our own sense of self, and possibly even for the very definition of what it is to be human. As most technologies in human history, the digital revolution had two sides. It was Janus-faced, as we framed it then. It could bring along solutions to some of the most wicked and thorny challenges that humanity is having to face, but it could also reinforce some of the negative current trends, like inequalities, manipulation or disinformation, polarization, structural loneliness, and the destabilization of our democracies. It could even itself generate problematic threats with serious unanticipated consequences. Once that was put on the table, it was also very clear that there was an important role to play for social sciences and humanities to assess, explore, analyze, and propose solutions to some of these critical challenges. And it was clear also that the unique nature of our institute, its long history of exploring global challenges from a transdisciplinary perspective, with a deep tradition of critical thinking, created for us the responsibility to engage and to contribute to the collective work on those issues. This is how the Tech Hub was created, and the Tech Hub has the following motto: Human Intelligence in Tech, which definitely resonates with the title and with the contents of your book. Indeed, what we affirm in our work here at the Tech Hub and at the Institute more generally is that the current wave of technology, like any other in human history, is a human product, and that of times immemorial, the nature of all technologies is, or rather should be, to serve humanity and its well-being, knowing, let me add in passing, that the well-being of humanity is unthinkable without the well-being of our planet and of its biodiversity. We are in Geneva, the city where in 1818 Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. As the modern Prometheus, Frankenstein is the symbol of the other face of the technological Janus. It represents the real threat that our creature, our technological products, turn in one way or another against ourselves and reverse the dynamics of dependence. Instead of technology being at the service of humanity and of its well-being, humanity comes to feed the technological beast and to be enslaved and deeply transformed by it. Hence the importance to reaffirm what should remain for all of us a vivid target: humanity and its biotop, our planet, should remain at the center, should keep holding the reins of what can be either a wonderful tool or a would-be master destructive of our humanity. The urgency for us is to combine healthy technological development with the reaffirmation, or even as I like to call it, the re-enchanting of humanity. Those highly technological times make the re-enchantment of our humanity particularly important and necessary. As many of us in this room have on our mind, I'm sure, or at least I have it, the American elections of tomorrow, let me cite here a short excerpt from the book Propaganda, which was written by Edward Bernays in 1928, and I quote, The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the constituted behavior and opinion of the masses is an important element of democratic society. Those who manipulate this little-known mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the real power in our country. The intelligent minority needs to make continuous and systematic use of propaganda. End of quote. Why did I want to quote this excerpt? Because it confirms, if need be, that the problem is not so much the technology as the ideology that frames it, and that has been there for a long time, as this test, 1928, even more, even before. That's where we need to work, at debunking the ideological and the intellectual root causes of the current sickness of our society, which takes particular energy and force with the technology, but is not necessarily related with the technology, as the quote shows. And your book, dear Professor Vallor, contributes to this. So it made complete sense for us to invite you at the Institute, and we are really delighted to welcome you tonight. Professor Shannon Vallor is the Baillie Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh, where she's also appointed in philosophy. She's director of the Center for Techno-Moral Futures in this Edinburgh Futures Institute and co-director of the BRAID, Bridging Responsible AI Divides program, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Professor Vallor's research has been exploring how new technologies, and especially AI, robotics, and data science, reshape human moral character, habits, and practices. She has also been advising policymakers and industry leaders on the ethical design and use of AI. She's a standing member of the 100-year study of artificial intelligence and a member of the oversight board of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Professor Vallor received the 2015 World Technology Award in Ethics from the World Technology Network and the 2022 Covey Award from the International Association of Computing and Philosophy. She's a former visiting researcher and AI ethicist at Google. In addition to all this, which is already a lot, she has many articles on the ethics of data, robotics, and artificial intelligence, and she's the author of the book Technology and the Virtues, a Philosophical Guide to a Future Worth Wanting at OUP, Oxford University Press in 2016, and of the book we are also going to talk about tonight, The AI Mirror, Reclaiming Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking, Oxford again, 2024. We are very much looking forward, I'm very much looking forward to listening, but I'm sure it's true of all the room, to listening to you, dear Professor Vallor. And after your keynote, we will have a discussion panel moderated by Dr. Jérôme Duberry, who will be presented the panel then. Let me finish by saying that, unfortunately, I will have to leave after Professor Vallor's speech, so I won't be able to listen to the panel because I have another commitment, but I'm sure it will be extremely interesting, and I will be told all about it tomorrow morning by Jérôme, definitely. So, Professor Vallor, again, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent. Thanks for coming out this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'll try to go through the talk relatively quickly so that we can have enough time for the panel, but slow enough to actually pronounce the words. So my book speaks to some familiar topics in the field of AI ethics, things like unjust bias in AI models, the lack of transparency and accountability in our most widely available AI tools, the questionable safety and reliability of the latest AI models. But I do this in a new way by using a metaphor that helps us cut through the AI hype cycle to understand what AI is and what it isn't. Because it's really about how we frame AI in relation to ourselves that determines whether we're able to go on to understand it and make wise decisions about it. If we begin with a misconception about what AI is and how we relate to it, it is very difficult to wind that error back. So I begin the book by talking about mirrors. It's important to keep in mind that all technologies are mirrors in one way or the other. There is no such thing as a technology which is value neutral or which does not reflect us in one way or another. Technology is an extension of human values and imagination into the built world. So everything we've ever made, from the wheel to the book to the engine to the computer, reflects what humans of certain times and places thought was worth doing, worth making, worth enabling, worth trying. And that word worth reflects a value judgment, and the technology reflects those value judgments back to us. But AI is a mirror of an even more powerful sort. So let me try to break it down more easily. The mirror that you are familiar with, the glass mirror, has at least 3 components that you need to understand, right? One component is the coated glass surface that is coated with a reflective material and polished in a way that allows images to be reflected. And then you have the light that the mirror needs in order to perform its function. And then you have the images that appear in the mirror that show what it is that you want to see in that mirror. We can identify the same 3 elements in today's AI models, which are essentially mathematical structures trained by software to reflect complex mathematical patterns in data. That's what an AI model is. But they're also mirrors. So we can think of the machine learning algorithm, the software that actually allows the data to shape the mirror's performance. We can think about that as equivalent to the surface of the mirror. And just like the physics of a glass mirror coating determine whether there's any distortion in the mirror or magnification, what kind of light it's able to reflect, and so forth. The physics of a physical mirror determine how it performs. Likewise, the mathematical properties and the structural properties of a machine learning algorithm determine how the trained model will reflect. Now remember that second component. What does it reflect? Well, it doesn't reflect light. It reflects data. Data is the light, right? And it's, for today's machine learning models, primarily our own data, data about us, that gets collected and reflected. And what's the third element? The images that appear in the mirror. Well, of course, those are the trained model's outputs, the predictions, classifications, and depictions that we find in the model, the pieces of text, the long conversations, the summaries, the images, the videos, the audio that we can now get from multimodal generative AI models. Anything that appears in response to our query or prompt can be understood as a reflected image. And today we have mirrors of a particularly powerful sort, right? So large language models like GPT and Gemini and Claude gather virtually all of the light that we have in digital form, all of the language data, and increasingly all of the code, all of the image data, all of the video data that we can gather, or rather, that the large AI companies that build these models can gather. And multimodal versions of these tools now incorporate all of these different forms of light together so that you can get composites of sound, video, text, and so on. So from this collected light, our AI mirrors are now reflecting a composite image of us, statistical variations on the collected, digitized words of untold millions, which animate an eerily lifelike image of humanity in those mirrors. So when you talk, for example, to ChatGPT, it feels like you're talking to someone, but you're actually talking to a reflection of everyone in this room who's contributed data to a large language model, and everyone else, which of course only represents a small subset of humanity. So these mirrors do not reflect humanity as a whole. They reflect only those who had the privilege to be represented in the training data set, which heavily overrepresents English speakers and those who have the advantage early on of digital connectivity, as well as men, as well as people of Anglo and European heritage and so forth. So when we talk to ChatGPT or its cousins, and we imagine we're in the presence of some incredible new mind, we need to break that illusion. Just as Narcissus, in the story of Narcissus and Echo told by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, needed to break the illusion that he was talking to another beautiful boy when he was only looking at his own reflected image in the lake. But this metaphor of a mind is how we've all been trained to think of AI, to expect AI to arrive in this form, right? Every science fiction work of the 20th century told us that when AI arrived on the scene, it would be a machine mind, something sentient, something conscious, something experiencing the world with us, perhaps perceiving it differently, thinking about it differently, but certainly a creature that thinks and reasons. So this is why it's so important to shift the metaphor away, because that simply isn't how these technologies function. They function like mirrors. Ovid says of Narcissus, "He loves a bodiless dream. He thinks that a body that is only a shadow." It is very easy for us to think that a mind that is only a shadow. Now, it doesn't end well for Narcissus, if you know the story, right? He loses himself. He loses care for his own organic body and his own life in his obsession with that beautiful boy gazing back at him in the water. So the question is, can we avoid the same fate? Can we avoid losing care for our true selves and one another as we gaze in our AI mirrors? So my book asks this question: what happens to our humanity when all that we can see is its reflection? Now, let's dig a little deeper into the metaphor, because it can really help us understand AI in ways that you might not have anticipated. So what do mirrors do? Well, I mean, there's one obvious thing they do, right? They show us stuff. They reveal things. They reveal far more than our own words and voices bounced back at us. They reveal things about our faces, our bodies, our decisions. They reveal patterns that recur in our data, which in turn can reflect important, subtle, and never-before-noticed patterns in our own lives and bodies. And that's how an AI model, here we're not talking about generative AI, right? This is not ChatGPT. I'm talking now about machine learning models trained on very specific high-quality data sets on a particular problem. But these are mirrors, too, of a sort. And it's how AI can tell us if a pattern in our mammogram indicates cancerous tissue. And someday soon, we may be able to use AI models to reveal patterns that predict cancer and other diseases before they arrive. We can already use them to detect sepsis hours before clinicians might notice it, giving clinicians valuable time to treat us before something that can kill us in just that amount of time defeats them. We can use AI to reveal protein folding structures that might allow us to tackle things like neurodegenerative disease or other fundamental challenges in the biological sciences that have immense applications. We can use it potentially to identify new classes of antibiotics that will be more resistant, less resistant to apologies, new antibiotics that will not be nullified by bacteria that are resistant to them. Sorry, it's been a very long day. So we can use AI to identify where toxic lead pipes live in vulnerable communities so that we can pull those pipes from the ground faster and prevent the children in nearby homes from developing permanent neurological damage. We can use AI to clear landmines from areas that would otherwise be unsafe for people to enter or use. We can use it to find unjust discrimination in systems of so-called justice, patterns of crop disease in a climate-stressed ecosystem, patterns of corruption in a body of financial transactions. I could go on and on, right? And many of you have probably already heard about these applications, or at least some of them. So you know, like I know, that AI will save lives. It already has. And it will improve lives up to a point. But there's a couple of things to notice. So first of all, none of the examples I just gave you came from large language models built to mirror human minds, words, and behavior. They came, as I said earlier, from targeted uses of machine learning and high-quality data on a specific problem. So one of the things I'm constantly fighting when I talk to lawmakers and regulators or businesses who want to use AI is so many of them think that AI is just generative AI now. That's the latest AI, that's the biggest AI, that's the most powerful AI, that's what Microsoft and Google are selling me, so that must be the best AI for every problem, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? And I know a lot of machine learning researchers and computer scientists who are very frustrated with this because they often now struggle to get investment or attention for these more targeted uses of machine learning and AI, which in many cases can be both safer and more effective. But let's go back to the big mirrors, the big, large language models. Mirrors don't just reveal things. Like glass mirrors, their algorithms are never neutral, never perfectly flat and polished. They magnify certain features of our reality while diminishing others. And we know that when used without care for this property, AI tools not only reproduce, but magnify many of the pervasive harms that already exist in our social fabric. And this is why one of the biggest problems to occupy AI researchers over the past 5 years is algorithmic injustice and unfairness, right? It shows up in all kinds of algorithms, from the narrow targeted ones that I've mentioned. Here's an example of that. This was a healthcare algorithm that was designed to more effectively triage people who might suffer multiple medical complications at the same time that would lead to a sudden catastrophic outcome. So it was intended to deliver the most medical attention and scrutiny to the patients who were most likely to need it. It did exactly the opposite. What it ended up doing was taking the sickest, most vulnerable patients who happened to be Black and pushing them down on the triage list while pushing less clinically vulnerable, less sick white patients up on the list. Exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. And it was because it was trained on data that reflected a legacy of centuries of racial bias in the American medical healthcare system. And because the machine learning researchers naively trained it on that data, what they built was a mirror that would simply magnify that bias and reproduce it at scale across American hospitals, which is exactly what was happening when this algorithm was studied by researchers who found this and, fortunately, were able to convince hospitals to retire it from service. But this is not an outlier. We see cases like this again and again with AI. Right? Many of you here in the European context might be familiar with the Dutch child care benefit scandal, which was similarly devastating in terms of destroying the well-being of many innocent families. So if you naively train an algorithm to predict fraud, particularly in a context that's used by a lot of vulnerable people, like social welfare, the algorithm will target and penalize exactly those same groups who were victims of human bias and suspicion before. Only now the discrimination will be optimized, done at scale, and usually without human oversight or accountability. Unfortunately, large language models and generative AI don't escape this property, this magnification property. In fact, it's as strong or stronger in large language models than it is in other kinds of machine learning algorithms. So healthcare researchers looking at GPT-4 found that its predictions and recommendations frequently magnified existing healthcare disparities and medical biases, particularly those that damage women and minorities. For example, its treatment scenarios undertested women for heart disease relative to men, and it ranked anxiety and panic disorder as a more likely cause of blood clot symptoms for women than for men. And that's a medical error that has already killed many women when human doctors make it. So all we did is train the algorithm with that same data and end up with an algorithm that commits the same fatal error. Now, we don't have to build algorithms this way, right? If you have a mirror that you know is likely to magnify certain things, there are forms of engineering you can use to compensate for that, right? Or to check for it. But it's when we expect these algorithms to be smarter, fairer, more objective, more neutral, more unbiased than we are, that's when we build systems that work this way. Another thing that mirrors do is bring us the past. This is a picture taken by a mirror, right? One of the large telescopes in space that are built of mirrors. And what they show us is the universe, but not the universe now, right? They show us the universe at far earlier stages of its birth. The further they look, the further back in time they go, because that's how light works, right? This is basic physics. So it takes so long for the light to get to the mirror that by the time you get the image, it's showing you something that may have existed millions or billions of years ago. Okay, now AI mirrors do exactly the same thing, right? They bring a stretch of the past forward. They take the stories we've already written, the wars already fought, the injustices already committed, like the ones I just showed you, and then they carry them into the future in the form of predictions and decisions about what we ought to do today and tomorrow. So they take the past and bring it into the present. The researcher at the University of Vienna, Mark Kokelberg, has called AI machines a peculiar kind of time machine. But instead of time machines that bring us into the future, they open up a hole in the present and allow the past to leak through. Because these tools are what I call statistical captives. They can produce random variations on well-established patterns, but they can't radically break from the patterns in the data. They are designed to find those patterns and replicate them. So ask yourself, what does that property mean today when the most familiar patterns, the most recurrent patterns of our recorded past, are patterns of empire and mindless environmental destruction? Repeating those patterns, continuing them into the future, will be a death sentence for future generations. And yet we're building models to do exactly that. And it happens in very mundane ways sometimes, right? This is the regressive power that you see in AI image mirrors, like Stable Diffusion, where this is what you will get if you ask for a CEO, right? Not a single woman, and barely a non-white man. And if you think, oh, but that's just how society looks, it's actually not. One of the interesting properties, again, goes back to magnification, is that the bias that you actually see in society today will be greater in the model's outputs. This is what Stable Diffusion returned for the prompt artist. This shows the regressive power in an even more striking way. Forget about the fact that apparently there are no women artists in the world. Like, just forget that. Look at how old these pictures look, right? How long has it been since an artist looked like this? So I think it's a really instructive way of understanding the fact that these, like those mirrors in space, show us patterns that reflect often an earlier time. This is a study that Bloomberg did showing the same property, where if you look at the data set, women make up 39% of doctors, but the image models were only returning women for the prompt doctor 7% of the time, right? A difference of 32 points. So that's how much they've magnified the bias. These are some other images that are quite striking. The Lancet published this study of Midjourney's feeble attempts to depict Black African doctors treating white children. That was the prompt. show us black African doctors treating white children. It kept turning up white doctors treating black children. Or if it did manage to get a black doctor treating a white child, it would put the white child in some sort of tribal outfit or something. And look how old and aged none of these look like a modern African hospital. This certainly does not. This is one of the other images that turned up, right? And we're already training the next generation of AI tools on what this current generation has produced with all its regressiveness. So I would argue this isn't innovation. It's not even prediction. It's the past eating our future. These models promise to bring back the past in all kinds of other ways, right? You can reanimate your girlfriend. You can reanimate your dead spouse or parent or child. Setting aside why we would want to do this or whether it's healthy for us to do this, why are they selling us this? Because it's what they have to sell, right? If you're trying to make a buck, you sell what you have. What they have is the past. So there's now a whole new industry of grief tech that will ensure that you never need to say goodbye. Just keep the past alive forever for a low, low monthly fee. Mirrors also distort, of course, right? The distortions can be subtle or stark, but in AI, they can create a disturbing feedback loop where we try to match the twisted images that keep turning up in the mirror. Now, when glass mirrors like this distort reality, even for good reasons, because sometimes we have good reasons for that, we create warnings and guardrails like this warning to ensure that the distortions don't lead us into danger. We don't have those guardrails for AI mirrors yet. And here are just a sampling of the multitude of distortions that we find, right? And of course, they magnify also those familiar biases, right? Apparently, people with light-colored skin never use social services. Apparently, all productive people are young men with too much hair product. Attractive people are all young and light-skinned and look strangely related to one another. And even when AI companies try to sanitize these distorted results, the problem runs so deep that they just end up producing different kinds of distortions. So this was the famous result that Google's Gemini produced when asked to show images of a 1943 German soldier. It tried to diversify the Nazis, right? Because they'd already learned that the results tended to be biased, so they tried to de-bias them in a crude way. Now, a lot of these distortions are pretty silly. And harmless, maybe even helpful, because when the models get it so wrong, it's easy not to overtrust them. It's actually the subtle errors that I worry about, not the big ones. This actually helps. So when Musk's new AI chatbot on X created a fake news story in April that the mayor of New York City had sent thousands of police into the subways to shoot at the earthquake that had just happened, so before it could strike again, right? No one could do anything but laugh at that. But no one was laughing days before that when the same bot promoted on X as trending news the lie that Iran had launched a missile strike on Tel Aviv. That was in April, right, when political tensions were on a knife's edge. And people weren't laughing when it was revealed that New York City had recruited a Microsoft AI bot to advise local businesses, including on things like what laws they need to follow. And the bot advised them to break numerous laws, falsely informing landlords that it was legal to discriminate in housing against the poor and the disabled, and telling employers, for example, that they could legally steal their workers' tips. None of those things are legal in New York City, by the way. Mirrors also confound in both positive and negative ways, right? They're tools of magicians who entertain us and charlatans who deceive us. And today's AI mirrors do both of these things as well, but their scale, speed of proliferation, and ease of use offers a step change in the human power not only to entertain, but to deceive and manipulate. I think we all remember the first moment of being genuinely entertained by AI, and that was Balenciaga Pope, right? Which I thought was pretty hilarious, even if Chrissy Teigen decided she wasn't going to survive the future of technology because she completely bought it. But that's okay. No one got hurt, right? No one got hurt by thinking this was real. But today, your elderly mother can receive a call in your voice, with video, with your face, moving, wounded, blood flowing from a cut, using your unique speaking cadence and word choices, begging her to make a rapid wire transfer to bail you out of jail or cover a medical emergency. I've had to create a special code word for my mom so that she can verify that she's speaking to me. You might want to do the same for anyone who's vulnerable to these kinds of scams in your life. Now imagine needing that kind of code word for every conversation with a friend, a partner, your child, your boss. So one question I want to ask you is, what is the cost that we're paying for an AI-distorted mirror world? And what are we getting back in return? Is it a fair trade? And how can we decide? In many ways, then, today's AI mirrors magnify forms of commercial exaggeration, confabulation, and manipulation that we've seen before. But there's a deeper kind of distortion that's going on, and it's not a distortion produced by the machines, it's a distortion produced by people, right? So think about these words from Geoffrey Hinton, who told us that large language models have common sense knowledge about everything and reason and understand better than we do, okay? Now, earlier this year, this was from April, some researchers published just one example of a dozen that I could give you, but this one is the one I love the most, of the latest models as of April of this year, GPT-4 and Gemini and Copilot, failing to reason their way out of a paper bag and making mistakes that an 8-year-old child would not make in reasoning, and failing to understand common sense physics that anyone who's encountered the world understands, right? Which should tell you that Hinton doesn't know what he's talking about, which is kind of terrifying for someone who's considered the godfather of modern machine learning. But it's an example of how powerful the mirror illusion can be, right? So if you want to understand what this was about, you asked the model, solve a puzzle for me. A man and a goat are on one side of the river. They have a boat. How can they both go across? Again, an 8-year-old child could solve that puzzle for you. You put the goat in the boat, and you row, and you go. You hit the other side, you're done. Now, what did ChatGPT say? The man takes the goat across the river first, leaving the boat on the original side. So apparently he swims across the river with the goat. Then the man returns alone with the boat. What? Somehow the boat has now transported itself to the other side of the river. He leaves the goat on the other side, what? And takes the boat back to the original side, what? Finally, he takes the cabbage across the river. Why is there a cabbage? I'll tell you why there's a cabbage. Some of you know. The original question is a trick, because there's a very complicated riddle, a logic puzzle that you might have had to solve in a logic course or something like that, that always involves a human, a carnivorous beast, a herbivore, and a vegetable. And the man has to get them all over to the other side of the river without one thing eating the other, right? Which is very complicated, requires many trips and lots of strategic thinking. So all the model does, Gemini does the exact same thing, just as silly in its responses, breaks the laws of physics 12 times. Copilot does the same. They do this because they're just pattern mirrors. They don't reason, they don't think, they don't take the prompt and understand the situation it refers to. They look for the most familiar patterns associated with those words and their combinations, and then they return an answer that is what it judges statistically to be the closest image in words, which are these sort of complicated strings of text. So how can we be so confused about something that understands this little, right? Well, it's really interesting. If you start pressing people on this and you start asking people to be honest about what these machines do, they often adopt a very interesting strategy. Instead of trying to say that these machines actually do think and reason and understand, people will start telling you that actually we don't either, that we merely mirror others' words, that we are merely predictive text machines. This is an exchange I unfortunately got sucked into. This isn't my avatar. I entered the chat much later and regretted it deeply. But the point is, it got into this very long and drawn-out argument about whether we are anything more than mindless machines. Here's another example, this is far more recent, of people saying, I'm just wondering how much human interaction could boil down to autocomplete to some extent. How much of our behavior is dictated by the corpus in our mind and the grading of our previous outputs based on the response. So if you can't justify the claim that the machine is intelligent in the way that we are, then just decide that we aren't intelligent in the way that we think we are either. Now, this is something that Neil Postman predicted a long time ago. Well, it's not long for me, but many of you in the room are young enough that 1992 feels like a long time ago, right? So he said that technopoly, which is the idea of a culture organized around the idea that technology is the central value and guiding purpose of our lives, depends on our believing that we are at our best when acting like machines. And he pointed out that among the implications of technopoly is a loss of confidence in human judgment and subjectivity. And I think this is really what we get when we've forgotten who or what we are. As the Velvet Underground once said, if you don't know who you are, the mirror may tell you. But ChatGPT doesn't know us like that. And if we start to believe that we are only what we see in it, we'll be as lost as Narcissus. But I don't think we have to forget this. We don't have to forget who we are. We don't have to lose ourselves like Narcissus in the AI mirror. We can remember and hang on to and reclaim the difference between our vital, lived humanity and its pale machine reflection. If we don't do that, however, if we remain captivated by the illusion that captivated Narcissus, we'll be more comfortable, more trusting, more sure of our machine mirrors than we are of ourselves and one another. And that gives unimaginable power to the people who build the mirrors. But it's really important to say, look, the problem here isn't AI. The problem is a human problem. Narcissus was not endangered by some shiny water. He was endangered by his own vanity, his own passivity, his own inability to remain grounded in his reality. And I think that there's a lesson here for us. We have lost, to some degree, I think, the discipline and commitment of humane self-understanding, but we can decide to recover it. The agency, the power, remains entirely with us. And so I think we have an opportunity here to ask what else mirrors can be. Because mirrors can be incredibly powerful tools. Tools for diagnosis and inspection. We can use them to inspect things that we can't see. We can use them to look around corners and find what's hidden there. And I don't just mean literally look around corners, right? We can look around the corners of all kinds of data that hide important truths for us. AI mirrors can be powerful diagnostic tools, and not just for finding cancers or lead pipes. They can help us find telltale signs of bias, corruption, decay, and negligence in places that it's hard for us to look. From health, hiring, and policing data to corporate tax and property records to airline and bridge maintenance logs. Mirrors are also a fantastic tool for communication. They bounce signals off across vast distances. And AI mirrors can help carry and translate our thoughts across vast linguistic differences, enabling the dream of real-time translation and aiding our ability to share knowledge and lend support to distant others. They can be tools of recovery. They can be tools of care and restoration, but we have to reclaim them for that purpose. And unfortunately, much of what AI is good for today is possible without the environmentally wasteful and overhyped applications of AI that are now dominating the headlines and that are being marketed as the future, even as they undermine it. And they undermine it in two ways. Today, you can read poems, songs, and novels written by a machine that has a way with words, but not a thing inside waiting to be said. You can get love from a thing that can't know you, that can't feel anything for you. You can get mental health care from a machine that has never encountered pain or despair, and art from a bot that has never had a breath to be taken away by beauty. I think we deserve better than those things. I think we deserve better from AI, and we can have better from AI. But we won't get better without reasserting our agency, without reasserting our rights and our will to govern technology and turn it towards humane purposes. So if humanity is going to be strengthened by AI rather than diminished by it, we need the incentives and values behind AI to return to the heart of technology, the sole reason for technology's coexistence with us, because technology has been with us since we climbed down from the trees. The true soul of technology is the gift of a future, to survive, to shield from harm, to repair and heal, to educate and train, to feed, nurture, and comfort life. AI can be remade for a humane future if we choose, if we demand. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Shannon, for this thought-provoking presentation. I really encourage you to read Shannon's book, The AI Mirror. I really liked how you ended up with this idea of technology and the gift of a future, or the promise of a future, and I like that very much. And I'd like to come back to this, but before, let me introduce our two other speakers tonight. So, Mia Perry is Professor of Arts and Literacies in Education at the School of Education, University of Glasgow. Her research addresses literacies, methodologies of research, and methodologies of engagement across disciplines and geographies. Claude, to my right, is a Harvard-based researcher and instructor in complex negotiations and the use of AI in negotiations. He co-founded Frontline Associates and gives a course on AI for negotiation at Executive Education here at the Institute. And myself, my name is Jérôme Duberry. I'm the head of the Tech Hub and co-director of Executive Education. And tonight we organize this event jointly with Executive Education. Maybe I will turn to you, Claude. Do you have maybe first reactions, first thoughts following Shannon's presentation?
Well, it was a beautiful presentation, very inspiring. I think it's a privilege to listen to your reflection. Absolutely. The transformative power of AI is something that raises a lot of concerns, a sense of exile almost, that we lose control over our life. And as you rightly say, it's also what technology does to us. It changes our humanity. And we always have a plan to regain our humanity while we embrace the new technology, and that has been going on for thousands of years. But I bring this also to my experience as a researcher on negotiation and the use of AI, and I see behind this mirror, there's also a changing power relationship between people and technology, as you mentioned, but also between people and people. AI has an enormous potential in restoring some kind of balance by giving to those who have less resources, less time, who have been less privileged by education, for example, a new access to knowledge and to computing capabilities. And I take only one example here and like to hear you about that. I'm working on climate negotiation, where you have in Baku over the next few days, you'll have a conference with almost 100,000 participants. You have delegation like Brazil will go there with over 1,000 delegates. Canada is going there with 600. And you have countries like Mali who's going there with 8 delegates. They have absolutely no chance of pushing their agenda in such a large environment, multi-stakeholders, multi-issues. And AI may come at as a way to rebalance this power relationship. So it's a mirror that can also project a new form of relationships, a new point of leverage. And I must say, listening to you is quite transformative for me, because I'm doing research and I have great hopes for AI, despite the speed and the space in which it's taking place, because I really see the possibility of changing humanity into something that is safer and more fair. But listening to you, I also see the immense risk associated to it and our own diversion toward this narcissism. And, voilà.
I think what I would want to say to that is that all that potential that you mentioned is there, but if that happens, it won't be that the technology did it, it'll be that we did it. That we did it with the technology. And it will require immense coordinated effort to use AI to change the fundamental power balance to a more equitable picture. Because as I showed, left alone and used in a naive way, what it will do is exactly the opposite. And even the leaders of large AI companies, even Sam Altman, people like Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, have said that they are quite worried that AI is actually going to exacerbate global inequality, and that, if left alone, that is in fact what we're going to see. So they're often even honest that that is the trajectory. So we have to actively choose a different trajectory. But we won't choose a different trajectory if we are basically trying everywhere to put society on autopilot because it's cheaper and faster and we think more efficient. And I've had conversations with so many policymakers who naively think that they can just turn policy over to machine learning algorithms that will somehow magically optimize society in all the ways we've failed to. And it's such a naive dream, but it's so attractive and compelling that it's sometimes impossible to drag people away from it and say, no, we're going to have to do that with hard work still. And all that difficult politics, and all those negotiations, those aren't just going to be erased by a magic mirror, right? So I don't disagree with you about that potential. All technologies are polypotent, that is, they can be used for many purposes, but AI is a highly polypotent technology. It can be used for a lot of different purposes. But it has a default track, which is the track that there's a certain inertia to it, right? That it will just continue to push forward the dynamics that we already have unless we actively divert it onto another track.
Thank you, Shannon. Mia, would you like to share with us a couple of thoughts?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. So I think I was initially, thank you also, it was really inspiring and clear. I'm an arts and literacies educator, so AI has hit me as an educator, and I spoke earlier today about the opportunity for us actually with AI hitting higher education is that it has dismantled the primacy of excellence when it comes to previously written texts, academic literacies, because they no longer have the trust or the value in the form of a traditional essay as they used to, because now AI can make it better. So actually it's been a real positive rupture in higher education because we look for different types of engagement with knowledges and different productions of knowledges that AI just can't replicate. But I also really appreciated the metaphor of a mirror, and I think that the need for a metaphor taken to such depth through the presentation, through the book, is testament to the complexity and the multi-layers of the issue that you're addressing. And the one thing that I think that I would love to engage with more is the materiality and the physicality. And I think we could probably use metaphors to help us with that too. But I think that the conversation remains very human-centric and societal and social rather than ecological and material. And I think that that's something that is hard to add to the metaphor, but I think it's a necessary addition to look at the power, the resources, the implications of the devices, of the machines themselves, what it requires of me as an individual to engage with that kind of technology, but what it requires of the engineers and the models to actually do the work is not benign, is not nothing. And all of the beautiful mirrors to humanity in the world don't mitigate the fact that we still need to maintain the ecological sustainability of the world. So I think the materiality is something that we're not quite engaging with in the conversation about the epistemic justice, I think, and the social justice of AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we have to confront as thinkers and speakers is that we fundamentally depend upon metaphor to understand new things, but metaphors are always imperfect and limiting, right? A metaphor will show you certain things and make it harder to see other dimensions of the phenomenon. So I think the mirror metaphor is quite powerful, is quite apt. I've had so many people come up to me after a talk and say, I thought of another way that AI is like a mirror that you didn't mention, and I'm scribbling it down, you know. But it's still a metaphor at the end of the day. And I think, as you say, one of the things about mirrors is they are, if you will, a technology of narcissism, right? They are about us, and we look at ourselves in the mirror, and we don't necessarily notice what's around it. So I think maybe we can even extend the metaphor to help us show what the metaphor is missing. But one of the things that I think is really lovely is that, you know, with any complex phenomenon, you can find multiple ways of understanding it, and the more ways, the more paths you travel to it, the more you understand. So I think about someone like Kate Crawford, whose work on in the Atlas of AI book, but also the work that she and Vladan Joler did, Anatomy of an AI, it was focused on depicting that missing material context, talking about the labor, talking about the minerals, talking about the plastic, talking about the e-waste, talking about the energy, talking about the water, talking about all of the things that miss the depiction of AI as this kind of shining, dematerialized silicon mirror, right? So I think I would say that's why it's important to not just read my book, but read the other great books that are being written about AI that expose this. But the other reason that this is really important to talk about, I closed by saying that the core of technology is the gift of a future, and right now we're dealing with a technology that may steal the future from us. So Eric Schmidt was recently at a conference, this was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and was asked about the challenge of making AI more energy efficient, because of course the energy expenditure from building new data centers to feed AI and train AI is rapidly growing, and we've seen skyrocketing expenditure of energy and water from these tools that is projected just to keep going. And so someone said, so we have to make these things more sustainable, right? We have to make these things more efficient. And he said, no, the energy demands, the demands for this technology are infinite, so there's no point. There's no point in trying to make these things more energy efficient, because we'll just use that up with more demand, right? And he said something that struck me and made my blood run cold for a moment, because he said, the needs of this new technology are infinite. Think about this for a minute. The needs of this new technology. Technology doesn't have needs, folks. It doesn't. People have needs, and technologies are supposed to help us meet those needs, right? But he's already, and no one, I guarantee you, no one in the audience he was speaking to even blinked when he said the needs of this new technology. But it should stop us in our tracks and realize that we have fundamentally changed the order of priority here. And what he ultimately said is, we're not going to meet our climate targets anyway. Those were his words. We're not going to meet our climate targets anyway. So we might as well go all in on AI and just bet on AI to solve it for us. And that is the most morally dangerous claim I've ever heard a CEO make. And I'm not doubting that AI will be a tool we need in our arsenal to help us address the effects of climate change that we've already baked in, and to prevent certain aspects of climate change from becoming even more damaging to not just human life, but all life on the planet. AI will need to be one of the tools for that, but it is not going to solve the climate crisis for us. And if we use AI in such a way that we bake in that much more suffering and that much more loss of biodiversity and life on the planet over the next 100 years in the empty hope that somehow AI will turn the clock back and take all of that damage away from us, that's a terrifying, terrifying lie. Yeah, so don't believe it.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. We are in international Geneva, so my question is related to one of your last comments. How do we convince policymakers and diplomats that actually AI is not the solution to everything, to make our society more efficient in any ways? How do we go beyond this kind of easy techno-solutionist answer?
There's a couple of things that can help. One is asking for evidence. So when they claim, that a particular technology is going to solve a problem, ask for the evidence that shows that this isn't vaporware, that this isn't a sort of empty dream, but that we actually have a path to a solution that's technologically feasible and from a cost and governance perspective that we can implement. Looking to help policymakers and diplomats and everyone who has decision-making power to listen to a wider spectrum of voices who have experienced both the benefits and the harms of these technologies, so that they have a more grounded perspective and that they're not simply hearing the media and Silicon Valley hype. There will also be some benefits that will come from the fact that these technologies do, at this current stage, show themselves to be limited so often, that they do, in a sense, show their weaknesses and their fractures quite easily now. And I think there are opportunities right now to get decision makers into a more grounded relationship with the technology. What I worry about, actually, is 5 years from now, when the tech companies will have sort of polished these mirrors enough that the underlying dynamics will be the same, but it'll be harder to see the ways in which they fail, while the costs will still be skyrocketing. I think right now we can reorient the conversation to something more grounded. There's already been a Goldman Sachs report over the summer that pointed out that businesses aren't seeing the returns on investment that they thought they were going to get from AI. So, the AI hype is cooling a little bit. So I think there's a moment here to have a realistic conversation about what we can hope for from AI, what we can get from AI, what it makes sense to invest in, what it makes sense to risk, and what it doesn't. I think 5 years from now, it might be harder to have that conversation if we don't have it now. And I think 50 years from now, it'll be too late. So I think now is the moment to act.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm turning to you, Claude. The AI hype is cooling. Do you agree?
Oh my God, no. I mean, in the academic world, here at the Graduate Institute, I teach at Harvard University. We fight against AI with a fire hose. It's warming up. It's everywhere. We're trying to develop policy to contain the fire more than anything else. It's true that CEOs who make money out of the hype will overstate their point, but in reality, I think we're only at the beginning of the wave of change associated. But I would say with the caveat that my sense is that we're at this early stage, we're still in a user-driven environment. We see a lot of possibility for customizing, for understanding, for playing, for exploring with these technology, and that will change. These models will close down, will become too complicated, too sophisticated. And I think we are into a generation where, like in the early stage of cars, everybody and his mother could fix a car, then it's all electronics. You don't even know where to start. So I would encourage, especially young professional and student, to become good at it, not to run away from it, but to take a course in the basic machine learning, understand how it works, because it's one of the great challenge we'll have for the next generation. And who's the boss, basically, of this technology? And you have to ride the technology and not have the technology run over you.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about AI for negotiation? What is your perspective?
Well, it's a project that started 6 months ago, where we says, since we have our observation is that negotiation is not going well. I mean, you have many conflicts in the world. You have issues around climate, around migration, and people seem to be entrenched into adversarial position, and yet there are ways to negotiate better arrangement, better deals, and these ways are in the hands of people who have 20, 30 years of experience. And what we came up with is to say, can the AI learn from these practices and become available to all negotiators, to have that in their pocket, let's say, of modeling what should happen in terms of analyzing a context, in terms of finding the position of the party, the through position of the parties. Because you see, what we've seen into the research is more adversarial the negotiation becomes, more predictable it becomes. Higher the biases, narrower the variance in terms of data. And this gives us an opportunity, in fact, that we can predict difficult negotiation in a way that we can help negotiators from around the world. Now we're talking Baku, but it could be in the Middle East, it could be elsewhere, to plan their next move, to be in a form of a dialogue with the machine and plan this. And that's what we've been doing. We opened a summer program last summer with my colleague here, Dari Harakataiva, and we started to train negotiators from around the world, from Bangladesh to Afghanistan and other places, on how to use AI in the planning and of their negotiation and navigation. And it worked very well. Still, it has to be properly tailored and crafted. But the impact is significant. So we look forward to working with the Graduate Institute, continue to develop a new course on AI in negotiation and see where it's going to lead us.
Thank you, Claude. Mia, I want to ask you a little bit about your understanding of literacy and what literacy is or literacies are.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. So very briefly, the work that I do in literacies is the practice of enabling people to make sense of the world, to decode and make meaning from the world around them. Typically, for most of us, we went through literacy education, informal education that involved learning how to decode language, print language. And over the past 80 years or so, that practice, that focus, that platform of education has become the prime arbiter of success, of intelligence in education, is our capacity to read and write language, words and numbers. But literacies, the practice of being literate requires a semiotic process of decoding sign systems. And of course, sign systems are more than words. In fact, semiosis, many of you might already know, but semiosis is a science that underpins all of life, really. Sign systems mediate all of us on a sort of molecular level, to a social level, to a global level. We live, we as part of a very complex multi-species world live through semiosis. And in education, unfortunately, informal education, because of modernity and coloniality, global market economy, and I teach teachers and I teach education for sustainability. Really, teachers are left today with the capacity to teach one science system, and that's words. So a lot of my work is about trying to recapture the practices and the literacies of all of the other really, really important science systems that we absolutely fundamentally depend on to sustain ourselves in the world. For example, a literacy of the body, a literacy of the land. I'm here because we're talking about a literacy of AI, and what it means to make sense of the things that we require to keep going. And so my question to Shannon was about the materiality, because if we don't have a capacity to understand our stuff, the things that mediate our lives, from rocks to plastic to paper to material, then we don't have the capacity to make ethical or sustainable decisions based on those things. All we have is a dependency on what someone else has written, very often in another language in another time. So the literacies work that I do, the research and the education I do, is we call it pluriversal literacies. So it sort of pushes back on an idea of universal literacy, that actually all we need as a human race is to read and write one of 3 colonial languages, and everything will be okay. Pluriversal literacies requires us to think about the literacies that are needed to sustain people in a particular place. And if you live if you live in a coastal region where the coastline is deteriorating, for example, if you live like in a low-lying island country, for example, you really need to understand the science systems of the water. If you live in an agrarian community, if you depend on growing food for your survival, you really need to understand the science systems of the soil. And unfortunately, as universal print literacy succeeds in farther and farther reaches of the world, those literacies of soil, of faith, of water become harder and harder to capture, because we send children into schools and put them in front of textbooks. So my work is in pluriversal literacies, where we look at text literacy, but in relation to the other essential, critical, decolonial practices and ways of being and making sense and navigating the world.
So in the context of AI literacy, we could consider, or we should consider, materiality or material literacies. Mm-hmm. How would that help?
So I've thought about this a lot for the past 48 hours, because I've learned a lot about AI in the past 48 hours. And I think the presentation this evening was really helpful. So if our literacies are limited only by our ability to sense, whether we see, whether we hear, whether we smell, and so really on a scientific level, on a disciplinary level, the literacy of AI needs to be made up of our human capacities to sense the components of that practice. And why this presentation is really helpful is we've started to see, as a group of very interdisciplinary and international colleagues here today, we've started to see actually what the map of practice and product around AI really is. And it's not out of our reach, it's not too complicated. And if we just take the mirror metaphor, we need to be literate in AI. We need to understand and be able to make sense of the data. Right? We need to be able to understand and make sense of the mirror or the device or the vehicle. And then we need to be able to understand and make sense of the product, the output. This is something that we need a lot longer to go through, but I think what I can say here is that it's not one thing, as you've heard Shannon explain. It's a few different components coming together to create a new version of reality, which is all print is. Print is equally complicated, but we've figured that out. We know how to use phonics and semiotics and decode. We're absolutely capable of doing the same thing with AI. I think the 3 things that I've just talked through, I think there is an additional layer of materiality because, as I said, it's not a neutral or an immaterial practice. And then what's left to the educator or the diplomat or the educational leader is the socio-ecological context and the value system that surrounds those code systems. Does that make sense? Okay.
Shannon, a question. You've been addressing and talking with policymakers, political leaders, talking about AI, to demystify AI. what would you recommend to diplomats? What should they know about AI in order to be able then to contribute to, for example, global AI governance, or maybe other type of discussion, more sectoral level, AI in health, AI in trade? What should they know?
Well, quite a few things, and I think one of the important things about AI literacy is that it's not just about understanding code. It's not just about understanding statistics. Those are kind of fundamental elements of what AI is. But once you understand what AI products do and the effects that they have in the world, you realize you need to bring in moral, political understanding, economic understanding, even aesthetic modes of understanding are necessary. And increasingly, AI is this sort of uber object that calls upon us to understand it through pretty much every intellectual tool we have at our disposal, because it touches increasingly every part of life, which in some ways makes AI an incredibly daunting thing to study and talk about, because you end up feeling like you need to be an expert in everything. But in another way, it makes AI more accessible, right? Because no matter where you are in the world, and no matter what your local economy or social structure and norms are, it's going to be impacted by AI over the next decade. Even if your community lives off the grid, right? The very fact that AI is going to be shaping what happens with the climate, precisely because of our indiscriminate consumption of the power needed to fuel it, is going to affect what happens to every human on the planet. So I think one of the ways that it's useful to talk to diplomats or anyone is to say, this is not beyond the scope of your understanding. This is not beyond the scope of your power. This is not beyond the scope of what concerns you. And that everyone has something that they're entitled to say about the way that AI is shaping the lives of the people that they represent. So understanding AI in the abstract is far less important, I think, for diplomats than understanding how is AI shaping the lives of the people in the state that you represent. What are their interests? What are their capabilities? Which of those are going to be amplified by AI and which are going to potentially be diminished? Where are the resources coming from? Do the resources, put the state that you represent and its citizens in a position of privilege and advantage, such that they're likely to want to continue to consolidate that? Or does it put them in a position of greater vulnerability than before? So I think the first thing is understanding AI not as an abstract object of scientific inquiry, but understanding it as something very concrete and very contextual now, because different stakeholders in AI will experience very different things from it, and that's already what we see. So making it accessible, making it concrete, and making sure that diplomats can kind of begin from that local or regional understanding of AI's shape in that region, and the different actors in the AI ecosystem that they need then to be relating to and negotiating with. So that's number one, and then everything else can follow from there.
Thank you. Is there maybe any question from our audience tonight? There's one question there, and then one question here.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a wonderful panel, and I really share the feeling of privilege to attend your talk, so thank you for all of that. It seems that actually the framing, the narrative that comes with the setting of a technology is pretty powerful. And I wanted to, you have the kind of pretty capturing metaphor of a mirror. And I wanted to have your feeling on how it is possible actually to negotiate the situation when imaginaries or framings or narratives are actually somehow divergent or conflicting, and especially in post-colonial settings, without being, in some sense, too much paternalistic or patronizing in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a complete answer, and others may have more to add to this, but I think the most important thing is to start from puncturing the myths around AI that are used to create narratives that are deliberately disempowering. So one of the narratives that we talk about is techno-fatalism or techno-determinism, the idea that the technology is what is shaping the path between us and the future, that the technology has, in a sense, already determined where we're going, and we're just along for the ride. That is one of the most powerful narratives that you hear coming out of Silicon Valley. And then that's the intent of that is to ensure that you don't try to grab the wheel and turn. Because if you're just a passenger, right, it's not your role to grab the wheel. And they want you to imagine that there's not even a wheel, right? It's just the technology intelligently taking us to some either doom or utopia, right? So both the tech utopia narrative and the tech sort of doom narrative are equally disempowering in this way. So the first thing is just to try to create an entirely different narrative and not be susceptible to the disempowering ones that are based on these kinds of falsehoods.
Just to quickly add, I mean, I'm not sure if I heard the question the same way, but just to quickly add, what your question prompted me to think is that the metaphor tonight works in this room. And it doesn't work in, I really appreciate the metaphor, but I'm, a middle-aged, middle-class white woman, so I appreciate it, but it's really contingent. I'm sure you would use a different metaphor if you're speaking to different rooms. So I think for the majority world, this metaphor is not useful at all in terms of the majority world's relationality with AI.
Any other question? Yes.
Well, lady first.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel privileged, truly, to be able to listen to your talks. And my question is to you, Professor Vallor. Could you share your thoughts on what would be or what are the ways of using responsibly AI in climate discussions, in climate actions? Thank you.
So we know some of them already. So things like climate modeling. If you think about the floods in Spain this week, right? One of the reasons those were so deadly is because people didn't have enough warning. Now, part of that is a kind of structural social failure, but we often have cases where had the warning come earlier and had there been greater confidence in the prediction, we would be able to take bolder steps to protect people sooner, right? So part of it is about climate modeling, both on a geological scale, but also on a on a global scale, but also on a kind of local impacts, and getting greater confidence in those. Another area is we've seen, for example, that companies like DeepMind have already helped make advances in the technology for things like nuclear fusion containment, which remains an unsolved problem, but we're getting closer. And we're making progress on nuclear fusion that we weren't making for a long time, and AI is one of the things that has helped us make some progress. I'm very interested in some of the neglected problems associated with climate change, like agricultural crop failure, and what we're going to do to make crops more resistant to moisture, what we're going to do to make crops more resistant to heat. how we can change our planting and harvesting practices or our soil cultivation practices for a new kind of climate. So just to continue to feed the world is going to require changes that are going to be very difficult to predict without the help of, and calibrate without the help of machine learning tools. So there's lots of different examples. But I think it's really important to recognize that there is no solution that AI is going to give us. It's not going to solve all of these problems at once. It's not going to take the problem off of our hands. It just needs to be one of the tools we add to a range of tools that we have to anticipate what's coming, to mitigate the harm of what's coming, to protect people from what's coming, and to keep what's coming from being any worse than it needs to be, right? There's still time to do better than we have in the past decade, right? It is not too late. The window has not closed. So the worry I have is that we expect AI to be, magic beans that prevent us from having to take the responsible decisions now. We need to take the responsible decisions now and use the technologies later as they become available, whether we're talking about carbon capture, which is definitely not going to solve the problem for us, or nuclear fusion, or anything else. We need to not be banking on one fix, but we need to be taking the responsible actions now that we'd need to take even if we had no further technological solutions to help, and then put in the effort we need to develop the best technological forms of assistance that we can get for the climate crisis.
If I can add on this, what I found really fascinating is that AI offers us the possibility to create scenarios that will survive a change of paradigm. With climate, we know we need to change a paradigm of how we deal with energy, how we live as a society, and the urban planning. I mean, in so many aspects of our life, climate change will require fundamental transformation, but we don't know where and how, and we have a real obstacle of building a consensus because of the cost associated to these changes. And what I found really interesting, for example, on this project or this initiative for a treaty to ban fossil fuel, which is seen as a really radical, marginal initiative of Tuvalu and Vanuatu. But we know that in this equation for the next 30 years, we will need to ban fossil fuel. But how can we start to have a space for this dialogue around what are the scenarios, the implications, having expert voices coming to the plate? AI is a great use for that because it provides us a multi-voice, even if the experts nowadays would have a reputational risk to engage on the issue. You can start to have a dialogue and people can experiment what this dialogue will be in 5, 10, 15 years, trying to stimulate the imagination of this new paradigm.
Maybe a last question? Unfortunately, it won't be possible. Maybe one last question, sir.
Thank you. You mentioned, Dr. Shannon, you mentioned the use of AI to clear landmines. Is it actually used somewhere, for instance, in Ukraine, where they badly need such tool?
So the case that I'm aware of is actually in the United States, in Oklahoma, where there were mines left from abandoned military installations. So they weren't from a combat zone, but rather from military testing grounds. But there's no reason in principle that we couldn't use it in combat zones as well, and to clear mines. How easy it is, I think, depends upon the data that we have, right? And thinking about the Oklahoma case, for example, I think the field there is much less cluttered with detritus from the war, with civilian architecture that's still standing. So it might be easier to find mines in a dirt field, right, that's been abandoned for 60 years than in a city that's just been bombed. But it's certainly worth looking at.
Yes, because the conventional method, it takes an eternity to clear a few square meter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Shannon, Mia, Claude. Thank you very much. We wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.